Hello, and welcome to the Anamnesis.podcast. I am your host, Dr. Hanna Lucas. And this is my good friend, soon to be Dr. Joelle Lucas Cook. So, here at the Anamnesis podcast, we are trying to remember, for the sake of our forgetful race, some of the abiding truths of the gospel and how that kind of works its way out into kind of all facets of philosophy and theology and just life in general. So our aim is to heed the advice of Jeremiah, the prophet, who says that we need to stand at the crossroads and look and ask for the ancient paths and look for the good way and how to walk in it. So in our modest little conversation that we're going to have today, we're going to just keep our eye on where is the kind of ancient wisdom by which we can be nourished and edified towards our goal, which is to honor and glorify Jesus Christ. All right, so I'm really excited to have Joelle with me today. We are former PhD candidate buddies, and she was very precious to me in my PhD time. So, and she's been doing some amazing research on friendship, which is what we'll be talking about today. So, to start out, Joelle, do you want to just introduce yourself and where you're from, what you're doing, what you've been studying, what's up with you?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, and I've traveled around quite a bit. So I went down to California for a while after I did my bachelor's, which was in Michigan, and then I lived in West Virginia for a while. I did a lot of work kind of in like nonprofit stuff and pro-life stuff. And then I just couldn't get rid of this feeling that I had to continue being a uber nerd and reading all the time. And I really wanted to go to England and be in a place full of history if I was going to continue work in the humanities. And so that kind of all led me to Durham, where obviously I met Hanna. Hanna was one of the first people I actually met when I came to Durham. And yeah, it's been a wonderful 6 years now in the UK. Last year, I met my now husband, and we have our first baby on the way. So a lot's changed, and a lot of unexpected things have come into my life since following the Lord all the way to a foreign country. And now I'm at the final stages of wrapping up the PhD. I'm just waiting for my viva and hearing back from the experts about how I did, and then we'll see what's next. So
That's awesome. Pardon me for a second. So good for podcasting to have a big loud cough there. It's so authentic. All right, so let's chat about what your doctoral research has been on. So maybe just introduce the general idea, and then we'll kind of get into the specifics of how you drew that research together and what your dissertation is looking at and arguing.
Sure. So when people ask me what I research and they want a slightly longer answer than just friendship, I usually give them just a little backstory in terms of when I was doing my undergrad, the place I was at, we had to do a thesis. And I remember, I think I was probably 22, 23, and all my friends were getting engaged, and there was the whole like romances in the air, and I was very, very single. And I just remember sitting there thinking one day, especially as I had just been reading C.S. Lewis's Four Loves. And I asked myself this question: if I were to die today, would I die saying that I never experienced what it is to be truly loved? And I thought about it for a moment because, so much of what I'd seen around me focused on this romantic love and finding the one and getting married and all of this stuff. But I thought, actually, I don't think I could say that I would die unloved, because I've known such deep deep love from not just my family, but also the friends that I had cultivated up to that point in my life, especially given that the way I had been kind of surrounded by education wasn't just education for the sake of a job, it was education for the sake of edifying your soul. And so I'd made all these friends where we were edifying our souls together. Um, and so that just it sparked something in me of, wow, friendship is so important that it tells me that I actually know what love is. So why do I not hear about this as much? Why do I not see people talking about this? What is this? What is friendship? So I went to my supervisor and mentioned these vague ideas I had, and he suggested I just get started by looking at who would have influenced C.S. Lewis. Why did C.S. Lewis write what he wrote? And that turned me on to realizing that a lot of the greats that I had grown up studying with, the great books, Aristotle and Cicero and Thomas Aquinas and these ancient Greek people, the church fathers, they all talked about friendship. And so that made me even more intrigued. And so every opportunity I had from then on, I started reading about friendship or finding ways to write my papers on friendship. I did a master's at Durham before my PhD, looking at friendship during the Reformation and how friendship really came to be appreciated in a different way through the scholastic movement that happened at that time. So there's lots of interesting facets. I've come across a lot of very interesting authors along the way. And then I wanted to do my PhD on friendship, but a huge part of my thesis took shape about a year and a half or 2 years into my thesis, which was realizing that today friendship is, well, not just friendship, but our all of life is deeply impacted by technology. And so I thought, it's really going to be difficult to look at the ins and outs of cultivating friendships, making friendships, having whether they break down or whether they last, how we communicate, all of these different things, if I'm not also looking at the technology that we use towards our friendship. So technology then became, I would say, like another half of the puzzle, the pie of my thesis for my PhD. So that's where I am now.
And I will ask you about this, but I know in that latter question about like what does friendship look like today and the impact of technology, you also did what do you call it, like ethnographic research, or you did some sort of like empirical research.
I did, yeah. I conducted some interviews with lots of different people.
Yeah. So I think we'll get to that. Let's go back and let's chat about a sort of class, like who are the greats, who are the voices that you kind of looked to kind of discern this sort of richer and thicker vision of what friendship is. And yeah, you could sort of maybe feature some of those voices.
Yeah, sure. And so one of the things I did, this is more or less the first main chapter of my thesis, is looking at the classical authors, but also looking at the biblical authors and kind of comparing and contrasting them. So obviously, talking about the Bible, it's this is massive book, but there is quite a lot even from Scripture. I think is a really good starting point, especially as a theologian, to look at what does God say, or what. And often it's not as much in rules unless you look at a few proverbs, but a lot of friendship is told through story. So I use the examples of Ruth and Naomi in female friendship. And I also looked at David and Jonathan, the classic example. And then in the New Testament, I looked specifically at the Gospel of John, which some scholars have argued that friendship is actually one of the main themes of the entire Gospel of John, and that friendship is kind of God's way of, or John's way of showing us the gospel come to be personal and how it's meant to draw us into relationship with God and then make us whole so that we're also in relationship with others. So I looked at that, and there were some things that started coming out to me specifically when I looked at biblical friendship, such as the role of obedience, which I thought was kind of strange when I started seeing this pattern come up. And I thought, obedience is not the first thing I would have ever thought of with friendship. But you see in these stories of, say, David and Jonathan, or Ruth and Naomi, this sense of when you love someone to this extent that you're willing to sacrifice for them. It's not just that you're willing to sacrifice for them, but you see their desires, and then you operate your life in a way that says, I want to be obedient, in a sense, to fulfilling those desires and making your wishes manifest in your life. And there's a specifically if those desires are in line with the will of God, it was especially drawn out. And then that became even stronger when I looked in the New Testament, where we see Jesus, I think it's John chapter 15, where he says, I don't call you servants, but friends, right? Because I explained to you the will of the Father. And then later on, he says, and you will be my disciples, you will be my friends if you do the will of the Father, if you are obedient to what I call you to. And then the next verse after that actually kind of shows this reciprocation, which I didn't notice until I was doing this study, that God also says back to us in friendship, and whatever you ask of the Father, I will give to you. And so there's this really interesting underlying theme of obedience to each other in the will of God as a part of Christian friendship, which I thought was very, very interesting. Of course, there's other themes and stuff that you could draw out, but I think that I'll leave it there. And for the classical authors, so Plato and / Socrates, dialogue about friendship. Aristotle takes a lot of what Plato says about Socrates' ideas of friendship and kind of turns them into this more formulaic understanding of the nature of friendship. And then after him, I looked at people like Cicero and Plutarch, and they're all asking roughly similar questions, sometimes a few different questions, about the nature of friendship. How many friends should you have? Is an old friend better than a new friend? With these general ideas of a true friend is someone that you pursue virtue with, that you are seeking to become something better than you were with before. They do, pretty much all of these authors do recognize that there are levels of friendship. So the person that you meet at the fishmonger or at the coffee shop is not necessarily your bosom friend. And that we have all these levels of acquaintance, and that they should be respected for what they are. That's not to belittle these other relationships, but when you're looking at this higher level of deep, abiding, intimate, long-suffering kind of friendship, that it has to have this soul cultivation as part of it. And I think that's what makes it, one, when they talk about how many friends you should have, they you have to limit these kinds of friends because you can't have depth with breadth. And that generally, not to say that new friends aren't good, but that you should prefer your older friend because you have more time with them, and you grow over the years an ability to grow deeper. And the deeper you get, the more ingrained in the other soul that you become, is kind of the idea. So those are some of the ideas that seem very prominent for the classical authors. And then after the classical authors, you get a lot of the church fathers, and they often drew on what the classical author said. So, famously with Thomas Aquinas, he just refers to the philosopher, who is Aristotle, and he takes a lot of what Aristotle says and Christianizes it. Saint Elred, who he was a monk in the early, I guess, 10th century, I believe. He was one who specifically took Cicero. He really admired Cicero's work, and he said, the only thing that's missing is Christ. So we're going to basically take Cicero and then put Jesus in it. And I love that they had no shame about that. They didn't
Mhm.
think that was a weird thing to do. Um, and so again, there was a theme of kind of taking these ideas, but then showing how Christ fulfills them, or Christ adds this depth
Mhm.
that Christ allows you to go even further than the classical authors thought you could go, because rather than virtue, for example, you also get faith, and you get spiritual virtue, right, which Thomas Aquinas talks about, these theological virtues infused by the Holy Spirit. So there's more depth. Anyway, that's kind of I guess, a brief overview of the ancient writers.
No, it's really good. And I'm already beginning to sense the dissonance between just this really brief sketch you've given and I think about today. But I don't want to get there just yet because I want to milk the cow of the classical tradition first. Um, yeah, but that's really good. Um, are you able to give like some slightly more specific insights, maybe the ones that have been most interesting to you in kind of each of these steps? So you said a bit about the scripture. If you want to say more about that now, you can. But like maybe one thing from oh, who did you go to next? Some of the fathers.
Mhm.
I mean Aquinas, Aelred. Just like is there and I'm actually quite interested in like where kind of Aristotle and Cicero go, and then how maybe their pairs like Aquinas taking Aristotle and Christianizing the philosopher, and likewise with Aelred and Cicero. If you want to just unfold that a little bit more.
Sure. And one of the things that came up in as comparing these dialogues for me was who who can we be friends with? Which I think is an interesting question. So, for example, when I was reading a lot of the ancient Greco-Roman philosophers, there seemed to be this idea that, I should say, for all authors, there's needed to be this sense of equality, so that people weren't, um, I guess, looking down on someone or confusing, say, friendship with charity. Um, but how equality was actually manifest or qualified was different. And it seemed that it was a much more, I guess you could say, secular or naturalistic kind of view for the Greco-Romans. For example, equality would be measured on wealth or status, would be one easy way. Like it would, and Aristotle says it's not that a slave couldn't be friends with his master, but there would have to be some kind of lowering of the higher to the lower. And there would be all of these inequalities that could make that relationship difficult. Um, but he did say that you could offset certain inequalities. For example, a king would arguably have great difficulty making friends because he would be at the top of the chain. But say a philosopher could befriend a king, in that while the philosopher didn't have money or status or wealth in the way that the king did, he could provide wisdom, which the king lacked. And so that they could kind of balance each other out with the things that they had to offer. When you look at the biblical examples, it doesn't seem to be so much related to wealth or status. It's actually an equality of disposition in terms of one's relationship towards God. So when you look at David and Jonathan, for example, later in the stories, these men seem to be relatively equal, right? Jonathan's the son of the king, and David becomes the successor. But when they become friends, Jonathan is older. Jonathan's a warrior. He is the son of the king, and David is a shepherd. And he works in the court, I think, at this point, for Saul. So he's made somewhat of a name for himself, but he has not really risen to any kind of equal ranking to merit a friendship with Jonathan. But what knits their heart together is their similarity and their desire to see the will of God be lived out in their lives. And then when you look at Ruth and Naomi, right, you have this widow who is Jewish, who is befriended by her daughter-in-law, who is a Moabite. Granted, neither of them have hardly anything to offer monetarily. Oops.
I'm back. Sorry.
Neither of them have anything to offer, but there is this difference of race and kind of background, especially in a culture where who you are matters a lot. And again, it's not based on their ethnicity or their rank. It's based on Ruth's desire to serve God by loving Naomi. So I saw that as a stark contrast, which then becomes even pushed even more when you get to the New Testament, right? Where Jesus is God coming down saying, I am the king of all of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I have come to be friends with
you, miserable offenders,
exactly.
as the prayer book says.
Yes. And so it really pushes on that idea from Aristotle of, can a king befriend a slave? And he really struggles with that. But I think it's interesting, and this is what Thomas Aquinas points out, is he says, even Aristotle acknowledges that if the higher person lowers themselves, that a friendship could be achieved. And so he takes this idea of Aristotle and says, that's exactly what Christ did. Christ took himself and lowered himself to become a human, took on human flesh in order to dwell among us and become our friends. And so he takes this idea that Aristotle has and then applies it in a way that Aristotle would presumably have never thought possible. Mm-hmm. And so that's just one example of taking some of these classical ideas and then almost subverting them and fulfilling them through Christ. Yeah. I'll pause there for a minute.
No, I love it. And it's touching, this is somewhat tangential, but it's touching some themes that are in the patristics, which you may be aware of, but you know how like both the patristic and the medieval theologians, as you said, are like entirely shameless and have no problem absorbing wisdom from the classical tradition. And Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa and probably others call that spoiling the Egyptians. Yeah. Have you heard that?
Yes.
You know about that, right? So, well, we'll say it for the audience's sake, but that, like, in the same way that as the Israelites are being freed, it says that, like, God kind of softened the heart of at least the people, not Pharaoh, but the Egyptian people, and they're giving them all these riches, all this kind of gold and gems and all this stuff. And so they plunder their oppressors as they're leaving. And eventually those treasures, yes, first some of them are melted down to become an idol, but later they are repurposed and find, as both Augustine and Gregory would say, they find their fulfillment in beautifying the tabernacle in the worship of God. So that, like, this isn't really a foreign kind of like a weird imposition of something foreign, but it's almost like the point of those riches of the Egyptians, or the riches of, say, the classical philosophical tradition, the purpose of it was always to adorn the tabernacle, i.e. to adorn, to help us along and to make beautiful and to give us language for, or whatever theological truths that were kind of always there. So I just love that. Yeah, I love the plundering Egyptians. So, and you've done it beautifully. Okay. What I was noticing in what you were just saying is it sounds like a sort of biblical and a classical vision and a patristic and medieval vision of friendship is exteriorly oriented, right? So you've mentioned kind of soul, you've said the word soul cultivation, or kind of journeying together towards the pursuit of virtue, or in the case of like the biblical exemplars, both being kind of ordered towards the will of God, and that in John's gospel as well. And this is probably a spoiler too, but like, I think that's another point of distinction and dissonance between today. So do you want to just talk a little bit more about that? And maybe you've got some better vocabulary for it, but like a friendship being something oriented to something higher and external to the two or however many involved in this relationship of friendship.
That's a great, yeah. Well, so I think two things. The first thing I'll say is this question of can non-Christians truly experience friendship is a question that a lot of the patristics bring up. Specifically, St. Augustine, I haven't touched on him yet, but he also writes about this quite a lot, especially when you look at his confessions and he's kind of comparing and contrasting, say, his sinful friendships of childhood where they stole because they liked to steal things, and they found pleasure in taking fruit that wasn't theirs, not even because they were hungry, just because they were sinful. Versus later in life, this comes out especially in a lot of his letters, this deep passion that he has for these friends that he's cultivated as a Christian, where they share this brotherly affection in Christ, which is also echoed in St. Elred, who obviously really understands this as a monk living amongst all these other Christian men. And of course, St. Thomas Aquinas would talk about this in terms of the theological virtues, that you can't fully understand faith, hope, and love. And love is the way that you find, friendship is a manifestation of love, I should say. And so there becomes this issue, this point of contention that I think is hard, especially as modern people, to look at that. And initially, I even remember reading these things and feeling quite affronted as well. Of can we really say that someone who doesn't have the Holy Spirit can't understand friendship? Well, they're not saying that they can't understand friendship, but they're saying that your friendship is only going to go as far as they are capable, without having that window of their soul opened by the Holy Spirit in order to let friendship invade that part. And if that part's not opened by the Holy Spirit, how can you experience it? And so I think that there becomes then this question in modern society of, what does friendship look like, especially when we've totally removed God from the picture? And it seems to me that there begins to be a lowering. And of course, I mentioned briefly that Augustine has these different levels of friendship. Specifically, he has virtue friendship as the highest. Then he has friendship of utility, where someone is useful to you. And then you have friendships of pleasure, someone that you just enjoy being around. And it seems to me that the more we erase God and we erase virtue from our language of friendship, the more we're relegated to these bottom two layers of friendship. And even in my interviews with Christians and non-Christians, people seem to have this wrestling sense of, I desire something deeper, but it doesn't seem like my culture knows what that is, which I thought was really interesting to hear from both sides, secular and Christian alike. But there's another point that I brought up in my thesis, which I thought was really important, and that's the role of truth. And our understanding of truth, I think, is very fundamental to the outworking of friendship today. And what I mean by that is, in these classical understandings, whether we're talking about the patristics or even the Greco-Roman philosophers, they all had this sense that there is a universal truth and that we are all held under it, that we can live in opposition to it, but that doesn't negate the fact that the truth is there, and that it's ideal to be living as closely aligned with the truth as you can. Today, a lot of culture lives in this, because we're in a postmodern culture where truth is relative. There then becomes, I think, this issue that affects friendship on multiple levels. But one specific way I think it can affect friendship is in a very practical way. Say that you have two people and they want to cultivate a friendship, but they have drastically different views of what good behavior looks like, of what cultivating meaningful community looks like, of what right and wrong is. And so as these people seek to be friends and someone starts engaging in a behavior that the other sees as detrimental and the other sees as good, this can cause a lot of friction in that friendship, because rather than having a goal that they're both trying to aim towards, and when someone comes and says, what you're doing is wrong, rather than saying, thank you for correcting me, although perhaps begrudgingly, instead saying, what are you doing? Why are you saying this to me? I can live how I want to live. I think that puts that puts the brakes on a friendship in terms of where they can go and how far they can travel together, if that makes sense. So I think the role of truth has undermined friendship in terms of how people can actually aid one another in making decisions in their friendship as they journey together in life.
Yeah, and that's really important. So when you're talking about these different levels of friendship and the importance of truth, and then you talked about the kind of the removal of God, then like another way of saying that would be like the removal of the reference to the transcendent, or the removal of the transcendent altogether. And so it sounds like a sort of a pre-modern, covering all of those kind of eras, a pre-modern vision of friendship is oriented towards the transcendent and like a journeying towards it. And say maybe the kind of Greco-Roman vision has a sort of well, I was going to say atheistic, but it doesn't. It just has a sort of maybe like a Neoplaton, whatever. I'm getting in a mess, but it's got a vision of transcendence, but not kind of a personal God of the Bible and of Christianity vision of transcendent. But maybe now is a good point to pivot, because you've already alerted to that level is either kind of deconstructed or missing. And so do you want to talk a bit about the research, what'd you call it, like your empirical research or your ethnographic research that you did? And that line, I mean, please revisit that line, whoever that, that one of the people you interviewed, saying that like, I do long for more, but I don't know that my culture knows how to access it. So would you like to share a bit about that side of your research project?
Yeah, it was helpful. I conducted 12 interviews, 11 which I could use. There was an audio issue with one, unfortunately.
Oh.
But it was interesting talking, I think, to people of different genders and different backgrounds, different ages. One of the things I was hoping to do was especially by talking to people, say, in the boomer generation versus like Gen Z, to see, is there do people actually live up to the stereotypes we have for them? For example, like, are young people on their phone all the time and old people hate phones? Turns out most of the stereotypes didn't really hold up, and that people are unique individuals who have their own ideas and desires of how they see things and want to live, which was helpful in a way. Yeah, there was a lot, there's just so much that came up in the interviews. But I remember one of the things that really stood out to me was I was talking to a younger woman who was an agnostic. She wasn't a hardcore atheist or anything. And one of the last questions that I asked was, if you could be friends with God, would that change friendship? Or if you believe you can be friends with God, does that change friendship for you? And it was interesting that all of the people that I asked who, well, not all, but I'd say the majority of those who I asked who were not Christians actually seemed to enjoy the question. They didn't, I thought they might be put off by the question or think it was a weird question. But one young woman in particular, she said, I've never thought about it that way, but if God wanted to be my friend, that would have to make friendship holy.
Mm.
And I just thought that's probably one of the most profound things I've heard from someone who doesn't believe in God. but and I could see as she was thinking about this idea that even just the thought of could the transcendent be part of friendship?
Mm.
What does that mean? And she was also one of the people who was saying, I really want these deep friendships, but when I look at TV and movies and the culture around me, I don't really see, I don't, I don't see what I want represented. And I talked, one of the other questions we talked about was the relationship between romantic love and sexuality and friendship, and how do we actually differentiate between these things. And my assumption coming in was, because our culture is so over sexualized and so hypersexualized, that we have blurred sex and intimacy, and we've forgotten to see them as distinct things that exist apart from one another. Obviously they come together in points, but that intimacy is not inherently sexual.
Mm.
And it was helpful to see those that I interviewed wrestle through this question alongside me, and ask themselves, well, what really is different? Because, I could live with a friend, we could share our finances, we could plan trips together. You could have friendships that kind of echo marriage in very practical ways, but that sexual component's not there. But is there something else that's not there? And almost all of them were able to get to the point of saying, actually, that sexual relationship and the longevity of building a family is really the difference. But intimacy is something that I should have in friendship in a non-sexual context that's different from the intimacy I would have in marriage, but I can still have intimacy just applied in different contexts.
Mm.
And I need to remember that about friendship, that this is a place for intimacy. So anyway, those were just some of the topics that came up amongst many.
Mm-hmm. And like what that theme of intimacy, like what is do you want to give maybe a definition of that? And like why is that important? Why did you sense its importance, and why do you think your interviewees sense its necessity for us? Like what's its purpose? What
Mm,
is it? What is its purpose? This kind of personal intimacy that humans are capable of.
mm, great question. I think I'll say, so my church is reading through this book on discipleship by Rowan Williams. And yesterday we were reading through this chapter called Faith in Society. And one of the themes that he was drawing out was this idea that every individual is a profound mystery created by God. And that's part of the dignity that we need to see in each person, is that they are not just made in the image of God, but that there is this mystery about them. What is their destiny? How are they made? What are they made for? How is their design similar enough to me that I can befriend them and know them, but different enough to leave mystery and intrigue to see what makes them unique? And when he was talking about this in the context of marriage, he was saying basically that sex is part of that. Sex and marriage is there to bind people together for a lifelong exploration into the mystery of another. And I think that you could say something similar about friendship, that intimacy it's that unveiling of the soul. It's revealing parts of yourself to another person in a way that is, again, is not inherently sexual, and that it's a joy that we have in all sorts of different relationships. Parents get to do this as they watch their children grow up. Who is this person I created? Who are they going to grow up to be? Friends get to see this as they watch their friends get different jobs and travel and meet new people and get married, and you see your friend unfold into this person that you know, and you also still don't know. And so I think in a way we could say that intimacy it's an unveiling. And I see a lot of hope there, especially especially when people are single, or for whatever reason, perhaps marriage is not in their future. They are not called to a life without intimacy. They are not called to be this person who is an unknown. We're still called in many, many contexts and relationships, friendship being one of them, to have this unveiling of yourself before another person, where you come to know yourself more deeply and also come to know someone else more deeply.
It's really beautiful. Like it's really beautiful. And I love you using that word unveiling. And then it made me want to say like it's apocalyptic, like just to use that Greek word, like not in a revelation. No, it isn't. Okay, not in a revelation the book sense, but like
Yes.
it's great that yeah, your use of that word, and then me thinking like, oh, apocalypse, and then realizing that like it just flags that its profundity. I like what you're saying about. I love what you said about recognizing a similarity in like the human nature, but also recognizing that this person is a mystery, and watching them unfold. And so that brings me to another Greek word, because when in doubt, use a Greek word or a Latin word, um, like the word telos, right? Because we've talked a bit about being kind of oriented to something transcendent, or a soul, watching a soul unfolding and a soul moving towards virtue. But that assumes the soul was made for something. We're the human person, because we don't want to be Gnostics here. The whole person, the hylomorphic body soul composite has a design for Christians given by the Creator. And so then friendship is not merely incidental to our telos as people made in the image of God. Do you want to say something about teleology and friendship?
Yes, I would. I'm gonna sidetrack though to something that you said, and then I'll get back to that question, if that's okay. There's what you said about the body is something that I also really wanted to try to understand. That part came especially into this idea of technology. Like here we are on Zoom talking to each other. What does that even mean? And what's the difference between this and being in person? And especially when I asked my people I interviewed, I would say that the summary of all of these responses and these conversations was, I would rather a long distance phone call or Zoom meeting or video call or whatever with someone I really, really love than an in-person meeting with an acquaintance. But if I could have it, but my ideal situation is always to be together in the flesh with the person that I love. And so I thought that was interesting that there were like nuanced levels of kind of hierarchy, that it's not that we just prefer to be in person all the time. We really prefer to have our soul understood by someone, but because we're not just souls, we're also bodies. We would rather have our soul understood with someone's arm around us. And that point, I think, really brought home this teleology, or we might also say eschatological idea of the ends of friendship. And as I studied this, I started, the Bible is very clear that in the new heavens and the new earth, there will be no marriage. There will be no giving of people in marriage. There'll be no children being born, but love will be present, and the unity of the bride with the groom will be realized in heaven, and that the practical outworking of that is friendship, and that friendship is really the human relationship that's going to be manifest in heaven. And so like if you are married, your earthly marriage will end, but your friendship will continue. And I just thought that was a really beautiful thing and it's also, I think, one of those aspects that separates the classical authors from the Christian authors, because the classical authors really can see friendship only to the teleological end of a virtuous soul before
Right.
you die, right? But the Christian sees friendship as this already and not yet. And so they see friendship as this cultivation of virtue or godliness, this unveiling of the soul to the other, both on earth and in heaven. And so it's this like earthly picture of something that will be completed in heaven. And it really brought that home for me when I thought, Christ didn't just come to take souls to heaven, he came to take people to heaven. And he came not just to save his friends to have a relationship with us now, but to have a relationship with us for all eternity.
Mhm.
And so I think there is a beautiful eternal aspect that you can have as a Christian when you see that my friendships do not end in death. Death is just the gateway for friendship in eternity.
Wow. Wow. Like I feel so moved. I feel almost teary when you say that. It's another another deep repercussion that I hadn't really thought of like Christ's resurrection and what we say in the creed. I believe in the resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Um, yeah, and then that like friendship, then in the beatific vision, in heaven, friendship being being our end. Like eternal friendship and presence with each other and with Christ the bridegroom. It just, yeah, it's blowing my mind.
There's this really lovely book, and I cannot remember the name of the author, but the title of the book is called Knowing Darkness. And it was I've read a lot of books for this thesis, but this was one that made me cry. And it was without, I'll try not to give to, I'll just give it away anyway. It's about this priest and the story. He talks about friendship in this kind of story, like memoir of his life. And he's at this table with this, I think, an Orthodox priest and a nun, and these different friends he's accumulated on his journey through life. And he talks about the ways that they've loved each other through dark seasons and joyful seasons and all these different seasons of life. But the part that just like maybe I just lost it was he was talking about Christ at the grave of Lazarus. And he said, why does Christ weep when his friend is in the grave? He knows he's going to call him out of that grave in like 5 minutes, but he sits there and he weeps. And he said, Christ's love for Lazarus that he experienced at Lazarus's grave that made him weep was really the story of why he was sent in the first place, because all of us are Lazarus, and he weeps at all of our graves. It's gonna make me cry again.
Yeah.
Because he longs to call us out of that grave and have us live with him forever, because he doesn't want to be eternally separated from us. And that even that earthly death, those few minutes that they were apart, is like a microcosm of what death really represents and the life that Christ wants to give us. And I'd never thought of myself as Lazarus, and that God would weep over my grave the way that he would weep over Lazarus's grave. And then you find out at the end of this book that the monk himself is not actually sitting at a table with his friends, but he's weeping at their graves and remembering what these people have meant to him. It was just really beautiful. And every time I think about it, it just makes you cry.
Wow. What's the name of the book again?
Knowing Darkness.
Knowing Darkness. That sounds good, but it sounds like you got to like be ready for this one. Oh,
yeah.
Wow. We're going to draw our conversation to a close, which I'm really loath to do because this is really good. I have to pick up my daughter from school, but I'll ask you one more question because I've got about 5 more minutes before I have to run to the school. What, aside from all the high academic thoughts that you have, cultivated and put in your 200-page document, of your thesis. How has your research and your writing affected you personally and changed maybe the way that you thought, or how have you experienced walking through this research?
Thank you. One of the reasons I studied this was because I felt like it's such an applicable topic for so many people, myself included. And since I started studying friendship years ago, it's definitely challenged me. It's raised the bar. It's in some ways it can feel, I think, a little overwhelming at times where I think, wow, this is like, if this is the bar, I am not meeting it. But in also a good way though, of realizing that there will be no time in my life where I'm not seeking to be a better friend, and that's part of the journey of friendship. And I think it's encouraged me to have particular conversations. Like a few years ago, this is before I came to do my PhD, but I was obviously already thinking about this stuff. I remember having a conversation with my friend Brianna, who's my maid of honor at my wedding, and we both just sat down and had a conversation and said, look, we have pretty much lived in other states or different countries like our entire friendship, and that's hard. And sometimes seasons of life mean that we can't just text or call all the time, but I want you to know that I am like committed forever to be your friend. And that if you don't hear from me for a couple weeks or a month or whatever, it has no bearing on how much I want this friendship. And so are you willing to walk with me through the flimsiness of my humanity and not always being a good friend, to commit to friendship? And it's the first time I've ever had a conversation like that where, not quite to the extent of like a David and Jonathan covenant, but
I was totally thinking that. I was like, wow, you're making vows.
but
You're making vows of friendship.
yeah, but something in a modern kind of equivalent to that, of saying, rather than tiptoeing around and going, oh, they didn't call me for a month, do they still really like me? Or maybe they are trying to distance themselves. Like, that question's gone, because I know that this is a person who's going to be in my life. And there's a lot of reassurance in knowing that, that you can have that kind of solid footing in a friendship, which I don't think we see a lot of people talk about today. And so that's just one aspect that was really helpful for me.
Nice.
But yeah, it's definitely called me to even reconsider, why am I making a phone call instead of, meeting someone for coffee, or how am I prioritizing my time? And it's challenging. Friendship is definitely challenging, but it's given me some other ways to think through these things, which I think we all will come to times where we have to think about, are we going to continue a friendship, or what kind of energy do we have? And so just having the space to think through those things biblically has been really helpful, though I don't always live up to it.
Well, flimsy humanity walking together, hey?
Yeah.
Well, I am profoundly grateful for this conversation. I feel like it's just like the antechamber. Like we need to, I would love to revisit it again. I think this was really fascinating and fruitful and edifying. So yeah, I'm so grateful that we've been able to have this little chat together, and thank you for your time. Thank you, everybody who is watching or listening. And yeah, that's all.
That's all she wrote.
Bye.